Welcome to the research seminar here at the Institute. This is also actually a first session of a workshop on transformative ethics funded by the Swedish Research Council. And the speaker today, I'm very happy to introduce, is Professor Laurie Paul. She is the Milestone Family Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Cognitive Science at Yale University. Her research interests are in metaphysics, cognitive science, decision theory, and the philosophy of mind. And she explores a wide range of different topics, including the nature of the self, preference change, subjective value, temporal experience, causation, time, perception, biology, constitution, and essence. Quite wide-ranging interests in philosophy. Of course, she's published a lot, and she has two very famous books, one which is called Transformative Experience, Oxford University Press, 2014, and one on causation from Oxford University Press, 2013. And the Transformative Experience book has actually sparked a huge interest, both in philosophy, not just moral philosophy, but outside moral philosophy, but also in other disciplines, in academia, but also outside academia, in art, newspapers. There's a dance company too, right? Did something on transformative experience. At the moment, EuroPI, for a big interdisciplinary Templeton project on aspects of religious experience. And it was actually Laurie's work on transformative experience that inspired this whole project. I'm the PI of. We just replaced experience with ethics. So we're sort of generalizing, extending some of the insights from Laurie's important work. And so it's very fitting that you open this workshop here today. And the title of your talk is Value by Acquaintance. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. And also, so I got to know Christer when I first started writing about transformative experience. He's given me a lot of really important and helpful and thoughtful, critical feedback. And I don't know anything about ethics, so he's taught me some things about ethics as well. And I just want to say I really appreciated the conversations over the years, and I'm glad that they're continuing. So what I'm going to do today is I'll talk about transformative experience towards the end, but I'm going to start by talking about epistemology and about a debate in epistemology that I think is very related to value, and then bring in a little bit of philosophy of mind and cognitive science. And from there, we'll get to decision-making and transformation. Okay, so in a famous graduation speech to new recruits, General Sherman tried to moderate the enthusiasm of the new recruits. And he says, basically, until they experience war, they can't possibly understand the true nature of the death and the destruction that it brings. He says, I've been where you are now, and I know just how you feel. It's entirely natural that there should beat in the breast of every one of you a hope and desire that someday you can use the skill that you've acquired here. And he says, suppress it. So these are all these new recruits just graduating, about to go off to war. He says, you don't know the horrible aspects of war. I've been through 2 wars and I know. I've seen cities and homes in ashes. I've seen thousands of men lying on the ground, their dead faces looking up at the skies. Okay, so the point is that Sherman wants the recruits to know what to expect, but he also knows there's no way that he can actually describe the true awfulness of what's to come. So he's trying to prepare their minds for battle. What can he do? Well, all he can really do is warn them, right? Preparing them by telling them that they can't really know what they're in for until they're actually in the situation, really until it's too late. So as a new recruit about to go to war, you can be taught and warned and guided by experts, right? And from their testimony and their stories, you can know that at some level, you're likely to face terrible suffering and pain, either yours or those of your comrades or those of the population that you're interacting with. You can know that you might die. You can know that others might die around you. And obviously that you're going to sort of, be facing very grim and frightening parts of life. But in an absolutely important and essential sense, you don't know what it's going to be like. You don't know what battle is going to be like or what war is going to be like. You can't know even though you know that it will impact you, you can't know how it's going to impact you, how truly horrifying and frightening that you'll find it to be. And to acquire this knowledge of war, you have to go to war. That is, you have to experience it, right? And in this sense, you gain this knowledge by acquaintance. And in particular, to know how to disvalue going to war, you have to grasp its nature under, as I'll describe it, a phenomenal mode of presentation, right? By having the experience of actually being in the war. Now, I think that there is something strange about this. It's kind of a truism. That's why I have this. I have these quotes like from people like General Sherman, right? But it is conceptually, I think, puzzling, right? Why do you actually have to experience something like war before you can fully understand its importance for you? One explanation might be something about sensory content, right? It might be that for some experiences, some of their content is essentially sensory in some sense. And furthermore, that content is indescribable. And that would explain why testimony from others is insufficient in this context, right? And maybe something about the horrors of war, almost certainly, are like this. But I don't think that's the most general reason behind why experience can be necessary for the kind of knowing that I'm interested in. I think the more general point is that for many kinds of events, you can know beforehand that something is going to be some way. And also, you're right, like when you experience it, it is in fact that way. But before you experience it, you don't know how it will be that way. So applying it to the war example, the troops can know that war will be terrible, yet before they experience it, they don't know how it will be terrible. In particular, they don't know how it will be terrible for them, and so they don't know how to value it in the relevant way. Now, the distinction I'm making actually connects with a distinction that's been talked about quite a bit in epistemology, the distinction between knowledge that and knowledge how, which sometimes gets cast as a debate between an intellectualist and anti-intellectualists. Now, there's a lot of issues with this debate. I'm not a huge fan of the intellectualist position overall, but I'm going to take it as a place to start and assume that things get a little easier if you're an anti-intellectualist. So I'll just assume intellectualism. Now, Carlotta Pavese she's done a lot of really important work on intellectualism. This is a quote kind of describing the intellectualist position. The idea is basically that the intellectualist says that all knowledge is propositional. Okay, and if we think that all knowledge is, if you deny this, you think there might be a special kind of knowledge that's non-propositional, knowledge how. But if you want to say no, all knowledge in some sense has to be propositional, right? Then you have a problem because it's sort of well known and accepted that you can have all the kinds of propositional knowledge that you need for some situation, that you can get for some situation, and yet you can still be lacking something. And what's lacking in this example is like you could have all the kind of propositional knowledge about how to swim, right? But in the relevant sense, you might not still know how to swim. So you can know everything, all the propositional content, right? All the propositions about swimming, but so you can't do it. People use examples of like riding a bike as well. And so Pavese, the relevant part of the Pavese quote here is, in response to this style of objection, not knowing how to do something, intellectualists concede that knowledge is implicator of any true answer to the question, how could one phi, may not give one knowledge of how to phi. They just know that one has to do something to phi. They maintain, the intellectualists maintain, that for one to come to know how to phi in the relevant sense, one must know or come to know the true answer to the question, how could one phi, under a practical mode of presentation. So the issue here, right, is explaining what is often thought of as a kind of expertise. And the intellectualists will say, well, we gain expertise not just by knowing all the propositions about something, but also knowing those propositions under the right mode of presentation, the practical mode of presentation. Now, and the way I'm presenting things, in the example that I gave you earlier, the practical mode of presentation is generated by having the experience. So the thought is that experience of battle brings the knowledge of the kind of horrific content of war under a way of knowing, a practical mode of presentation. And in particular, I will say like it's a phenomenal presentation. That's the practical mode at issue. And what I'm interested in saying is that in these contexts, the context that I started with, right, the distinctive contribution that knowledge by acquaintance brings is the knowledge of how to value, okay? Or as I'm going to put it, the ability to value by acquaintance. So the thought is, just as we recognize an important way of thinking about knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge expertise, there's a dimension of value that I think also needs to be recognized with respect to this. So what I'm going to do then is explore this kind of epistemic structure of knowledge, how, right, as a species of knowledge by acquaintance, and explore how it's reflected, I think, in our capacity to value, and how this can have interesting applications for certain kinds of decision-making contexts. So the war example is intended to show how knowing that an event has a particular value doesn't imply that one knows how to value in every relevant sense. Sometimes you have to learn how to value under a phenomenal mode of presentation. Now, I think actually this is not a surprise that the role for knowing how to value an event in a practical way is intuitively clear to anyone who's undergone something difficult and painful or traumatic and is attempting to prepare someone else, someone who has never had that kind of experience, for what they're about to undergo. The fact that someone lacks the relevant experience, I think, can matter hugely because it means they lack a certain ability to appreciate the impact that that experience is going to have on their lives. You can tell them all about what the experience was like for you, what in general it's like for people, what kinds of changes to expect, right? And in this sense, you can tell them that the event will have a certain impact or have a certain value, but this isn't enough. In other words, knowing via testimony that something has a certain amount of value, I don't think is enough in all contexts to give someone knowledge of how, in the relevant sense, to value that event. And again, it's strange, okay? Knowing the nature of the event through testimony from others and knowing of its value in virtue of that, right, seems like an ordinary way of knowing, seems like something that we do all the time. And yet, experiencing the event teaches you something new. Through acquaintance, oh, we just lost my screen. I'll keep talking. It just says a screen saying value by acquaintance. So okay, what's strange about this, right, and which I mentioned before, is I don't think there's any obvious conceptual connection between experiencing an event and appreciating its importance in this way. I don't understand why testimony isn't enough, but I don't think it is, right? But one thing that might be behind this, right? Let's see what we've got next. Aha. Okay. One thing that might be behind this, right, is instead of there being a conceptual implication, it might be that there's a certain kind of physical implication. In other words, it might be just an interesting psychological fact about us as human beings, something maybe due to the physical limitations of the way that our brains work. It might be that something about being acquainted with an event through first personally experiencing it affects your brain, right, in ways that allow it, such an event, to become meaningful to you in a way that you couldn't appreciate without having that kind of sensory interaction. So the thought is maybe there's just something physically necessary in human beings such that they have to have the experience to gain certain kinds of capacities to value. This actually isn't crazy. In fact, there's some neuroscience that's relevant. It's plausible that visual or other types of sensory cortex actually have to be stimulated in order for the reward centers of the striatum, which is where motivation and decision-making is generally located, right? In order for the striatum to be activated. So it might just be that you need a certain kind of brain activity in one part of the brain to kind of awaken the brain in the other side, on the other side, okay? Maybe. I mean, there's some interesting research that suggests this. And if that's the physical story, right, then there's a kind of normative constraint that we can find here. Because remember, we're interested in decision-making and choosing for human agents, right? And so even if we're talking about an ideal human agent, maybe they have, maybe their brain is ideal, but it's still a brain after all. And we're talking about trying to understand how people can evaluate situations and assign value to events in a way that's meaningful and with expertise. So the fact that acquaintance might be necessary to know how to value in this way, even if it's merely a physical constraint, right? Even rather than a conceptual constraint, doesn't mean it's not normative. It still is normative. So it's not merely a descriptive fact about how ordinary humans fall short, right? It's a normative fact about how the bridge between knowing how to value, or between knowledge and sensory knowledge and valuing is constructed in human agents. Okay, so now there might be a conceptual connection, and I'm still thinking about this, but it's just not obvious to me how that would work. Love to talk about you with that about you with that. But I thought that we can also kind of see more about how this physical story might work by looking at a related debate in the philosophy of mind. And this related debate also brings out how discovering a new mode of presentation can change how we know. The debate is familiar to everyone. It's Molyneux's problem. Okay, so as Locke put the problem, right, this is about, say, somebody was born blind and could distinguish between a cube and a sphere by touch, right? And then, the way that Locke says it, suppose a man born blind and now adult and taught by his touch to distinguish between a cube and a sphere of the same metal and nighly of the same bigness, so as to tell when he felt one into other, which is the cube, which is the sphere. Suppose then that the cube and the sphere placed on a table and the blind man to be made to see. So the blind man can distinguish between the cube and the sphere via touch, and then magically the blind man is given the ability to see normally and shown the cube and the sphere, but not allowed to touch them. And the question is, could he distinguish between the cube and the sphere, right? So touching a cube versus seeing a cube are different ways of knowing the same geometric shape. So for this reason, right, it seems like there should be stable content, that the geometric content that translates from touch to vision. And there are blind geometers, so there obviously is. Like if the man knows the relevant geometric content, then he knows it. So that seems right. But in another sense, there's obviously something missing. And actually, in pragmatic context, people are unable. There's been a lot of work on people in India who after retina operations are given the ability to see. And there was some research done by a person at MIT suggesting that no, in fact, people cannot tell the difference merely visually without further evidence. There's more to say about that, but it does seem like this information is not available. But why is this way of knowing them inaccessible, right? If you have all the geometrical content, why can't you, if you were born blind and learned all of this, learned all the geometrical content through touch and intellectually, why doesn't it just transmit then into the realm of the visual? Well, the intellectualist has to have a story about this because the intellectualist thinks that all the content is propositional, right? Well, the natural solution is to regard discovering what it's like to see the cube versus what it's like to see the sphere, right? Involves a new kind of mode of presentation, right? So in other words, through gaining vision, the blind person learns about the shapes under a new mode of presentation, the visual mode of presentation. And this new way to know the old shapes generates a kind of cognitive reorientation. And of course, this is just a version of what happens when someone gains vision. If you grow up blind and then you're able through some kind of surgical means to gain vision, you know a lot of content already, you know lots of things, but you learn them under a new mode of presentation. And this brings a quite dramatic kind of cognitive reorientation. Okay, so going back to the recruits, right? Oh, sorry. For the new recruits to know how to value going to war, they have to actually experience it, right? In other words, to grasp that information under the right mode of presentation, one sufficient to teach what it's like to go to war, right? They need to go to war, and when they do go to war, they will experience, in fact, a dramatic cognitive orientation. So, like our blind person, right? Like how when a blind person undergoes a cognitive reorientation when they can see, soldiers who discover what war is like will gain new abilities to understand, to represent, and to make inferences about war and its implications. Okay, I said just like it, but it's actually not just like it, and I indicated this when I first started speaking, right? Because like in the case of a blind person gaining vision, the cognitive reorientation is generated by the new experience, right? But it comes through gaining a new sensory capacity. And so I think it's easy to see if certain kinds of experiences are sort of essentially sensory in some way, or there might be some kind of sensory content, why gaining the capacity to see will teach them something new. But in the case of the soldiers, the new experience isn't coming from gaining a new sensory capacity. Rather, the new mode of presentation comes from the physical, maybe the causal contact with the event itself. Okay? So again, right, in the blind case, the physical experience of the event changes how the perceiver knows the event and brings in a kind of cognitive reorientation. But the same thing, maybe in a somewhat different way, happens with the soldiers when they go to war. Okay? So again, then I'm going to come back to the physical point that I made before. There's something about the causal contact with the event that creates a physical change in the perceiver, right? And the thought is that this physical change realizes a new mental event or a new mental state, one connected with the striatum, right? Which endows then the perceiver with a kind of know-how. That's the story that I want to tell. But I think once we have this story, then we can make sense of the cognitive significance of experience, and in particular, of its significance as a vehicle for creating the new capacities to value with a wide range of kinds of experiences. And of course, as someone who works on transformative experience, I'm interested in the discovery of new facts like what it's like to become a parent, or emigrating to a new country, transitioning to a new gender, having a terrible physical accident, experiencing cognitive decay through Alzheimer's. All of these kinds of events, I think, involve both the presentation of facts in a new way and then subsequent discoveries of new facts as a result of gaining this new mode of presentation. And the thought is that we've now got a story for why people experience a kind of cognitive reorientation to content that they'd already been introduced to in a testimonial or a propositional way. Okay, so the focus then that I've been, or the claim that I've been making, is that this kind of cognitive reorientation might be necessary in certain contexts in order to have true expertise in valuing. And what I want to do now is say, yeah, okay, so we have this distinction that's familiar in debates about knowledge between the kind of knowledge you get, say, through testimony and the kind of knowledge you can have, knowledge how, through expertise. And we should apply this same distinction to valuing when we're doing decision making. And what I thought I would do is give you a couple of examples of where I think this applies and how we can apply it. So one way I think that the need for expertise in valuing comes into play in decision theories, I think it actually relates to classic problems or classic questions involving the reference class problem. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit now. The reference class problem comes, I guess, from, or at least it was famously stated by Reichenbach, right? And he says, if we're asked to find the probability holding for an individual future event, we must first incorporate the case in a suitable reference class. An individual thing or event may be incorporated in many reference classes from which different probabilities will result. This ambiguity has been called the problem of the reference class. So I think the reference class problem arises when we want to determine how likely some event is, but our assessment of its likelihood changes depending on how we frame or classify, or I would say relate ourselves to that outcome. Now, Al Hayek has a really nice paper called The Reference Class Problem is Your Problem Too. It's a great title. It's a great paper. And he argues that the reference class problem infects all the major theories of probability. And I just propose to accept that thesis of his. And in the paper, he distinguishes between the metaphysical question of relativizing the probability of an event's occurring and the epistemological question of knowing which reference class is relevant to the probability that we need to determine. So I want to focus on the epistemological version of that, right? So the thought is using an example, I guess coming from Venn, where we have to determine the probability. I'm just like quoting Hayek here, right? Where we explored John Smith, a consumptive Englishman, age 50, will live to 61. So if we're thinking about the reference class problem, right? Hayek points out, there's a lot of text here, but I'm sure this is all terribly familiar to all of you, but we're going to just work through it. Okay. Al says, look, our friend John Smith is pondering his prospects of living at least 11 more years. It will not help him much to tell him of the many conditional probabilities that apply to him, each relativized to a different reference class. Well, conditional on your being an Englishman, your probability of living to 60 is whatever, X, 50%. Conditional on your being consumptive, it is Y, I guess 52%. There went my, I'll keep going. I've got, okay. So, by analogy, in other words, so John Smith is faced with all of these conditionals. You can know all of the conditionals, right? And then Hayek points out, by analogy, when John Smith is pondering how far away London is, it won't help him much to tell him of the many distances that there are, each relative to a different reference frame, okay? So Al's paper is about basically how is probability to serve as a guide to life, right? And obviously I'm very interested in this too. And I think a lot of us are interested in like practical decision making and how should we use probabilities to guide our lives. But if probability is to serve as a guide to life, then you need to designate one of these conditional probabilities as the right one, okay? Now, you can just single out one conditional probability among them and insist that's the one that John Smith should use. But basically, that's tantamount to singling out one reference class of the many to which he belongs and claiming that we've solved the original reference class problem. Life, unfortunately, is not that easy, and neither is our guide to life. In other words, the reference class problem is figuring out which of these conditional probabilities is the one to pay attention to because they all metaphysically apply to him. And so there's this epistemological worry. Okay, so without some independent means for knowing which category he belongs to, John Smith is a victim of the reference class problem. How is he supposed to decide what to do? There's no meaningful sense without that information in which he can discover his probability of living to age 61. And I guess he's like buying an insurance plan or something, so he has to make a decision. This is actually something that I think we're all familiar with, and I'll put it in a more intuitive context for us now. So imagine like you're getting some anecdotal testimony from a friend, or you're reading about a scientific result in a journal, or maybe just in the newspaper that could have implications for you or someone that you love, okay? And the immediate question is to how to understand how the results that are reported by the journal or whatever should guide you. Okay. In other words, what you want to know is, well, how do I or my child or whatever, how do we fit into the tested population, right? Now, one way to solve the problem is to assume that the only categories that matter for your determination are kind of gross demographic categories like your nationality, your sex or your gender, your age, right? And if all that matter are those major demographic categories, then you can solve the epistemological version of the reference class problem just by brute force. Just, in other words, John Smith can say, conditional on being English, male, and aged 50, he's got a certain expectation of living to 61. The problem is, we can use those demographic categories, but in the real world, they're far too coarse-grained for the kinds of self-reflective reasoning and guidance that we want to undertake. That is, even when the demographics fit, okay, you might have other properties that you think are going to matter more for your planning with regard to life insurance, right? Maybe unlike John Smith, when you're thinking about your insurance, you make especially healthy eating choices and you live in a flat with a view of the Washington Monument, let's say. Well, then you need a way of determining whether these other categories matter, right? You have a certain expectation of living to 61, let's say, conditional on being English, consumptive, age 50, and a healthy eater. And you have a certain expectation of living to 61, conditional on being English, consumptive, age 50, and living in a flat with a view of the Washington Monument. Now the question is, which expectation is the right one to guide your choices, right? How are you supposed to know? Well, if you already know that healthy eating is what largely affects your probability of living to 61, then while living in a flat with a view of the Washington Monument doesn't, then you know what to take into account and what to discard, right? You solve the problem. But hypothesis, this is what you don't know. This is exactly what you're trying to determine. Okay, so that's the worry. Now, how does the reference class problem arise in the context of value by acquaintance, in my context? So recall that I'm saying that you have to be acquainted, at least for some kinds of events, to know how to value them. You have to be acquainted with them to know how to value them in the right way. In particular, you have to be able to value certain events under the right mode of presentation. Well, this means, in this kind of context, you have to be acquainted with that type of event to fully gauge its meaningfulness and importance to your life. This means that knowing how to value an event can play a role in determining which categories or which conditional probabilities are the right ones for you to attend to. That is, it can help you solve the reference class problem. So let's look at an example. Imagine that you're a music student and you have to make an important high-stakes decision Do you want to undertake an expensive, maybe uncertain, stressful, and time-consuming course of training to become a professional cellist? Is this something that you want to do? In such a case, let's say you go about making your decision by collecting testimony from your professors, including a lot of professional musicians, including, let's say, Yo-Yo Ma, about their own experiences and the experiences of those who've made such similar decisions. Okay, so here's a quote from Yo-Yo Ma, and he's being interviewed by on an NPR program by Terry Gross called Fresh Air, and asked about like how his experience of becoming a professional cellist has kind of changed and affected his experience in general. And he says, how do I play it? And what I discovered and what made it so beautiful for me is that, sorry, this is a little bit choppy because it's just a verbal interview. As he plays, he says, you actually get to code infinite variety. In a world where we can measure everything, or we think we can measure everything, how wonderful it is that you could have the poetry of music, or poetry of music that actually makes you think you are touching infinity. So what he's saying is, as he gained this kind of expertise, basically he discovered this way of being that for him he describes as the experience of touching infinity. Okay, great. So you get this testimony like this from Yo-Yo Ma and others about their experiences of being professional musicians as you're trying to decide like or assign value to this objective that you might want to try to aim for, right? And okay, now you're faced with making a decision. And obviously, as I said before, one way you could make your decision to assign values is to assume that the only categories that matter are gross demographic categories like nationality, sex, age. Okay. Using this testimony, right, of all the professional musicians then to make your own choice, you can infer that given your demographics and all those other kind of gross categorical properties that you share with the population of cellists, you can have similar conditional expectations. But I take it that the relevance of the conditional probabilities, what really matters to your own choice, depends on which of these categories are the right one. Right? In other words, does it really matter, like whether you're male or whether you're female, or whether you're an American or whether you're Swedish or whatever, or how old you are? Those things can matter, right? But it seems like other kinds of properties having to do with your personality or with your temperament might be more important. It seems like conditional probabilities determined by properties like how resilient are you? How hard are you willing to work? How do you feel about radical uncertainty? How would you respond to the experience of touching infinity, right? Those are the kinds of properties that matter when you're making your choice. The problem is, how are you supposed to know which of those conditional probabilities are the right ones when you're trying to determine your preferred conditionals? Well, you have to solve the reference class problem. Here's the way that we would normally do it. You reflect on your personality and your other characteristics. You imagine yourself training to become a professional cellist and assess how you would emotionally respond to such a life, right? You imaginatively evolve yourself forward under a mode of presentation in accordance with some kind of presumed causal mechanism, projectively assessing which features you'll have that will matter most for the outcomes. Put a different way, the hope is that you can use your imagination to assess the testimony you've gathered, right? Imaginatively applying what others say to your own case. And of course, the trouble here is that without being acquainted with the experience of being a professional cellist, with the experience of touching infinity, right, you lack the capacity to accurately simulate yourself in a way that highlights the relevant properties. That is, you lack the know-how that you need in order to construct the relevant de se mode of presentation needed to locate yourself in the right reference class. This is because you need to actually experience this kind of life as an expert cellist before you can know how such a life is likely to impact you. So you need experience to know which of the conditional probabilities actually matter for your choice, and thus you find yourself in Al Hayek's Catch-22. I think the same sort of thing arises for the problem of whether to sign up for the military in order to fight a war, right? You can know from others' testimony that war is terrible, but you won't know how to value the terribleness of war unless you experience it for yourself. And merely knowing through testimony that going to war has personal disvalue isn't sufficient to accurately gauge the meaningfulness and disruption that it will bring to your own world. Again, standard patch. try to imaginatively simulate what it would be like for you to be in battle, right? Et cetera, et cetera. But again, without actually having this experience, how can you know that you're accurately grasping the nature of this experience under the right phenomenal mode of presentation in order to assign value in the expert way that you're requiring yourself to do? Okay, so actually, once you look at some of the literature and discussion of the sort of intellectualist position, I think this version of the reference class problem has sort of been, it hasn't been explicitly, but I think it's sort of indirectly recognized from some of the debates. And in particular, there's a lot of debates about why knowledge how can't be transmitted through testimony, okay? And Yuri Kath has some nice work on this. And he says, look, the transmission of knowledge how by his testimony, like knowledge of how to ride a bike or how to swim or whatever the expertise in question is, right, requires the transmission of knowledge of certain self-involving facts that are required for the recipient of the testimony to gain the requisite knowledge how, right? In other words, there's a kind of implicit understanding in that literature that you need a certain kind of self-involving knowledge. And the problem is that self-involving knowledge isn't contained in the testimony that another person can provide. Okay, so the thought is, here we have a certain kind of problem with self-involved decision-making. I now want to draw another kind of connection, right? Because I think the type of expertise in valuing that I'm interested in can also be related to generative learning, which is a hallmark of human intelligence. Now I'm going to talk about a little bit of kind of computer science and cognitive science. Generative learning occurs when intelligent agents actively construct new relationships and make new associations between new inputs, including new experiences, and their already existing knowledge, beliefs, and attitudes. Okay. Now, the connection between generativity and knowledge how that I'm going to illustrate is going to go through the notion of an agent's being able to construct their own policy or their own plan in a context where know-how is required. So, call the distinction between being able to follow someone else's testimony about what you should do to get to a goal versus knowing how to assign value on your own and knowing how to kind of determine value on your own, a distinction between being able to follow a policy, a value policy in particular, and being able to author a policy, okay? So, and I'll come back to this. So there's, I think, an important distinction between merely following a policy versus being able to construct or author a policy. In computational cognitive science, a policy is thought of as basically a set of action rules that an agent can follow in order to maximize chances of receiving an award. So think of an agent playing a game like an agent with a maze in one corner. And hopefully I'll get my screen up here. Okay, good. Okay. So the idea is when you follow a policy to get to a reward, and what you have, let's see if this works. So here we have, these are duplicate mazes, okay? Here's the agent back here, and here's like the bad guy here, and here's like the happy bunny here. So these are duplicate mazes. So you'd use the same, if you wanted to get to the happy bunny, there's a set of instructions that you could follow, but you don't want to get to the bad guy, right? So you've got to have the right goal and the right value. And you'd also then have to have a set of rules that's going to allow you either to escape from the bad guy or go to the happy bunny. So the idea is that solving a problem involves getting to a reward in a maximally efficient way, okay? If you get to the reward, then you've successfully solved the policy or followed the policy. Or solve the policy, sometimes we talk about. And the thought is that the decision model encodes values for actions, basically related to the value of efficiently getting the reward. Okay, so all I've just described here, this is basically, these are what are called POMDPs, which are partially observable Markov decision processes. The whole thought is that you can model human behavior and decision making by building these models where agents have to kind of get to goals and solve problems. It's partially observable because they can't quite see what they have to do. So this is like a kind of blackout space here. And the idea is if you can build models where agents perform certain kinds of complex tasks, you reverse engineered the way the agent is deciding or thinking about things. This is a very standard technique. And I use it with my collaborators and a couple of other things. And many people use it in different kinds of contexts. Now, what I want you to see here, basically, is the distinction between having an agent, building an agent that follows a policy, right? And a higher level task, which involves designing the decision model in the first place, okay? So you can build any kind of robot to follow a policy. That's pretty straightforward. The hard thing to do is to figure out a way for an agent to actually build its own decision model, okay? In other words, building a decision model corresponds to identifying a problem and setting up a policy that will solve whatever that problem is, which requires something much more complicated than just following a policy. It requires the ability to understand the relative value of different action plans, okay, in particular for different possible outcomes or different possible environments, and to know, which action plan is the better one. So the difference, here's just a decision tree, a chess decision tree, right? Just as an example, it's like the difference between the ability to choose between nodes of an existing decision tree versus building the decision tree itself, okay? The ability to successfully design a decision model for a game requires the capacity to author a policy. And that's an ability of an entirely different order than merely following a policy, right? And the ability to author a policy, I think, is of a special interest because that's what's needed for the ability to solve problems flexibly, right? It endows an agent with the ability to create new kinds of policies in unexpected contexts. That's the whole point. And that's the sense in which it's generative, okay? If an author, like an engineer, can author a policy, they can generate new kinds of policies in new situations. They can choose between them without being told or instructed or programmed what to do, right? As opposed to something that just follows whatever policy has been laid down, no matter what happens. Okay, now, just to kind of one more example, compare an agent built to play a particular kind of game, okay? Can always win that game. Let's say AlphaGo or AlphaZero. These are like machines that can beat the best Go and Go players, right? Compare that to an agent that, when transported into a new and unknown environment, can build its own new policy for an entirely new kind of game, right? Basically, famously, a lot of machines, think about self-driving cars. Actually, maybe I'll just say this. Do I have there we go. Yes. So the ability to author a policy is basically the most elusive and prized ability in artificial intelligence today, okay? Lots of machines have been constructed with amazing capacities that exceed human ones on many dimensions. Obviously, everyone's talking about LLMs, but there's lots of other just deep neural networks generally, okay? And the problem still, right, is that these machines are still not able to frame, set up, and solve new problems in truly new environments. They can't respond in ways that weren't kind of prepared, that they weren't prepared for by their engineers. And that's why we haven't got fully self-driving cars yet, okay? And that was basically, this has been a hugely expensive kind of catastrophe for many companies. And it's safe to say that the development of the kind of flexible intelligence needed to author one's own policy in a new and surprising context is the kind of holy grail, basically, of contemporary AI. Okay. Now, I'm talking about this partly because I think just in general, philosophers should be attending to this kind of flexibility. This is like an issue that epistemologists haven't really paid enough attention to. But I think the focus on this ability and its role in machine learning connects directly to questions in normative decision theory involving decision models, in particular models that are apt for the kinds of human reasoning that we do. In other words, if we're building machines that are going to follow policies in new environments, it's essential that any such machine has the ability to take into account everything that matters for the problem that it's going to set up and solve, okay? Especially in a high-stakes context. If we're going to build machines that solve problems for human agents, such machines need to take into account everything that matters for human beings in particular, and to take it into account in the way that it matters for them, right? In other words, a machine needs to know how to assign value. And in particular, if a machine is making high-stakes decisions for human agents, it needs to know how to assign value in the ways that matter for human agents. So this is a version of what's discussed in some contexts of what's called value alignment, right? And this has been kind of a hot topic in certain kinds of parts of the of sometimes some places in philosophy as well. And I think it's become clear that, at least if we want high-functioning machines to perform tasks that align with human objectives, we need to build machines that can follow our value policies, right? Value policies that machines have need to align with human value policies. But by extension, then the distinction between being able to merely follow a policy versus being able to author a value policy becomes urgent, right? If a machine is supposed to make an important decision, for example, a decision about whether to deploy a nuclear bomb, right? It needs to have the ability to know how to value new or unanticipated outcomes involving human experiences. And without this kind of expertise, right? If the machine has to develop a policy all of a sudden in a new context, a context that its engineer has failed to anticipate, right? It's likely to fail, and it will probably fail catastrophically, as we see in small cases with self-driving cars all the time. Okay, so the broader point, right, is that nobody wants an AI to be in charge of very significant decisions if it can't appreciate the cost of widespread human suffering, or in general doesn't know how to value unanticipated changes in human lived experience. And the broader point then is this ability to value by acquaintance, which I've been talking about, connects to expertise and value assignment for experiences, whether the policymaker is human or machine. Okay, so the thought is that in any new situation, experts are needed, right? They have to supply facts and all kinds of content. But in some contexts, they might be needed to do something else. They might be needed to author a value policy for a new context, especially for contexts involving new or unexpected kinds of human suffering. And I think that we see this happening in the world today. Think about the pandemic, think about all kinds of destabilizing political situations that we find ourselves in. Okay, so the thought is basically when a policymaker is confronted with new or unanticipated outcomes involving human suffering, they must be able to evaluate these new outcomes under a mode of presentation that captures the relevant dimensions of such suffering. That is, they have to be able to author value policies in new contexts. And such an ability requires expert know-how. And what I'm saying here is expert know-how when we're talking about knowledge of how to value. Okay. Now, what I've just been arguing is that there's a role for value by acquaintance for authorship and high-level decision-making because of the need for generativity. But I think these kinds of questions don't just come up in the realm of policy. I think they come up in the realm of the personal. And that's the connection to transformative experience. Now, the fact that we assign value to the ability to author a policy, or that we should, the fact that we assign value to the ability to author a policy in these like large-scale policy contexts transmits to a context where we're making a personal decision, a first personal decision about our own futures or someone we love. Like the case of the person who's trying to decide whether they want to become a professional cellist, right? It's just as important to know how to assign value in a high-stakes personal context as it is in a high-stakes policy context, or at least it can feel as important. It's not as important in the sense of one person is not as important as many people, but it's just kind of, I think it's philosophically salient. Now, a transformative decision is a life-changing decision, such as a choice to become a parent, that involves undertaking a new kind of experience that will change who you are as a person. And when we're making a transformative, life-changing decision, either for ourselves or for someone else, value judgments involving the nature and character of our future lived experiences matter. And I want to describe such life-changing decision-making in terms of authoring a policy, either for yourself or for the person that you love. So to author this policy, you have to know how to construct the decision model, which means you have to be able to identify the problem you want to solve and set up a decision model for solving it, which includes knowing how to assign value to its various outcomes in order to determine preferences, right? And the problem in transformative decision contexts is that a person cannot author her own policy. She cannot frame the problem to be solved because she lacks the necessary experience. She doesn't know what the transformative experience will be like, so she doesn't know how to assign the full range of subjective values to relevant outcomes that the policy is supposed to apply to. Moreover, by stipulation, this transformation is going to change her values. It's going to personally change her. It will personally transform her. So she can't just map her current values onto her future ones. Now, and this is the kind of thing I've talked about like with Christopher for a lot, well, look, you can just like rely on testimony to make this decision, right? I mean, if you can look to expert testimony to tell you what your post-transformation values will be, then you can know that your outcomes are going to have certain values. So you can rely on this testimony to assign numbers to your value function, right? Richard Pettigrew is another person who's argued this. And actually, before I go back to that, so Pettigrew argues that you can resolve questions of transformative experience when you're making transformative decisions by just assigning the numbers that you can get through testimony. And when in the discussions that we've been having, I grant that you can rely on testimony to kind of build out the decision model, or at least I think in many contexts. But I say that something is missing, okay? And the thing that I think is missing, I described as a kind of authenticity. And I don't have a developed theory of authenticity, but what I'm going to talk about just for the next few minutes before I finish is this, a notion of authenticity that I want to articulate and that I was trying to get at. All right. So what Pettigrew says is, thanks, that should work. Good. Okay. So what Pettigrew says is, well, look, you can get authenticity too. And the way that he puts it, he says, well, when I use statistical evidence to set my credences about my own utilities, and then use those credences to make a decision, I'm not just like deferring to the majority, right? I'm taking the testimony of others as testimony about my own personal utility function, all right? So Pettigrew says, well, it's not inauthentic to use testimony. And of course, it's not inauthentic in one dimension to use testimony. But this is not the type of authenticity that I was trying to get at, okay? The problem with the transformative choice is not that I lack access to the testimonial facts about, let's just say, even my utility function, okay? The problem is there's an important sense in which I lack access to their intelligibility. Mark Johnston has a paper called The Authority of Affect that I think is relevant here. Johnston says, he's talking about something slightly differently, but it's the same point. It's because affect can be the disclosure of the appeal of other things and other people, that it can have authority in the matter of what we should desire and do. Okay, so by the authority of affect, I don't mean its sheer effectiveness, right? But rather that the fact that the presence of the affect can make the desire or action especially intelligible to the agent himself. In other words, it can make the desire or act seem apt or fitting in a way that silences any demand for justification. So the thought is basically, when you're choosing to transform and choosing to become a new self, all right, you're faced with this problem where the new self that you're going to become is unintelligible to who you are now. And I think we can relate this problem of unintelligibility to the earlier discussion of the reference class problem, along with this issue of being able to author one's own policy in a new context. So start with the reference class problem. So assume that the testimony that you have is accurate, well-meaning, sufficiently comprehensive, all the good virtues, right? But despite this, you face the reference class problem when you're expected to apply testimonial evidence to your own case, even if you're ostensibly a member of the population that the testimony applies to. Going back to our example of the professional cellist, right? Assuming such an experience would be transformative, right? Also assume that you've got relevant scientific testimony or an anecdotal testimony, right? To assess the well-being of those who have made the choice. How are you supposed to knowledgeably apply the testimonial evidence to yourself in a way that gives you the relevant expertise? In order to use expert testimony about your own values, you have to know which of your properties will matter for how the testimonial results apply to your own case. But the self that you're going to become as a professional cellist is unintelligible to who you are now. So to follow the testimonial strategy that that has been kind of advised in the case of a transformative decision, you either have to brute force it, okay, and ignore fine-grained conditional probabilities, or you need to know which of the facts presented to you by the expert testimony are relevant to your own self-involving facts. But in the latter case, you face the reference class problem. You're not able to determine how your current personal history, your individual quirks and disposition, are relevant to the conditional probabilities that you've been given through the testimony. So you're back in your catch-22. I think this also relates to the concept of authoring a policy as opposed to merely following a policy. So what's lacking? What am I trying to say here about what's lacking when I say when I say when you're faced with a transformative choice, there's an important sense in which your future self is unintelligible to you, right? Well, I think what's lacking is what in certain kinds of moral contexts gets described as a type of understanding. So Alison Hills has some nice work on this. There's a lot of discussion about like moral expertise and moral testimony. Same issues come up, okay? And Alison Hills says to understand why P, you must have an ability to draw conclusions about similar cases and to work out when a different conclusion would hold if the reasons why P were no longer the case. If you do have the relevant abilities, you can generate new true moral beliefs and perhaps new moral knowledge without relying on help or advice from anyone else. So there's a kind of personal understanding that one has when you have the relevant kind of moral expertise. And I think this lack of understanding in a transformative decision case is of the same type, right? In other words, it stems from an inability to subjectively integrate your knowledge of the value of the outcome, right? For who you might become. You lack the ability to work out for yourself how to value the transformative outcome in a way that relates to who you will be once transformed. That's why it's unintelligible. And so without this kind of self-understanding, you're being asked to rely solely on expert testimony to make this life-changing decision, meaning you lack the ability to author your own policy, so you must merely follow a policy. So put another way, when making a transformative choice to change, if choosing rationally requires you to rely solely on expert others, because these experts know you better than you know yourself, then choosing rationally requires you to give up self-authorship. Okay? You have to simply follow a policy for your future self rather than authoring a policy for your future self. And I think this might be why adopting the testimony strategy to solve a transformative decision problem, right, requires us to give up a kind of authenticity that we can define as involving a concept of self-authorship, which stems from the lack of expertise and intelligibility about the future self that one is bringing, one's own future self that you're bringing into being. And this, I guess, is proof, as if proof were needed, that youth is wasted on the young. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, it's time for the Q&A session, and we also have people online, I think. And so online, you have to put your questions in the chat function. We do have a sort of follow-up option, so you can have a finger on another person's comment. So you have to then mention which person you want to comment on. Okay, shall we start with people in?
Yeah. So we have Anandi.
Anandi, yeah.
Oh.
By the way, we don't know everybody's names. So if you have a hand and we don't know.
You can switch. I don't have any more slides, so you could probably switch to the.
I'll also say, sorry, that the first half an hour is recorded.
Oh.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. I really enjoyed that. I have some kind of puzzles. So I'm thinking when we make decisions, we always have to rely on memory about the past in order to do so. So whatever we assign value or probability to is going to be based on our memories. And episodic, like we can distinguish different types of memory, right? There's like perceptual memory of kind of phenomenal aspects of experience. Mm-hmm. And there is implicit memory of like, that's kind of encoded physiologically and comes out in behaviors. And then there's like declarative semantic memory. And I think these three differ. They're very different from one another in terms of how long they last, in terms of how, various different types of brain impairment mm-hmm. can affect them. And the thing about kind of phenomenal sensory memory is that it's very short-lived. It only lasts a few seconds, whereas semantic memory lasts a very long time. And implicit memory, the kind of bodily memory that underwrites our ability to do things, like underwrites our know-how, is long-lived and can persist even when the declarative memory is damaged. Mm. So one thing I just wonder about is how your account of valuing is requiring this aspect of past experience, which is extremely ephemeral. Like how then do I rely on that? Because from one minute to the next, I might lose that, that really kind of phenomenal aspect, that mode of presentation of the experience, though I may still have the semantic, declarative memory of the experience, which has the propositional content.
Where would you classify proprioceptive knowledge?
I mean, I think
memory?
that's phenomenal. That's it's phenomenological, although there's going to be, I think one part of the problem I have lies in the discrepancy between the sort of phenomenal character of experience and the sort of know-how stuff, which I think is often just very, maybe non-propositionally encoded in sort of physiological routines, which is why it's preserved even when declarative memory is lost. Whereas proprioceptive, sort of all the sort of phenomenal aspects, the sensory memories, those are just, they fly away. We don't have them anymore.
But once you have it, the whole point is that like once you have the experience, even if like when you ride a bike, so you don't represent in like, it's not like seeing red, but proprioceptive representation is, I'm happy to call it, as you did, like phenomenal in some sense. And once you have it, it's not like you have to explicitly recall it, right? In order to like continue to ride a bike. It's rather that, as you said, it's like neurally encoded in some sense, and we have the ability to call it up. So you have knowledge how, and value would work the same way.
See, this is where I think there's a distinction between the different processes or the different types of memory. Because the ability to ride a bike, of course, you're going to take in, as you ride the bike, you're going to take in information about your current state, right? And your ability to respond appropriately to that is like encoded in neurally and in your physiology. But that's not, so though those...
And it has a feel.
And it has a feel, but I mean, it's not that you have memories. Like that's
what I'm saying.
You have a current experiences, right? There's no memories.
That's what I'm saying. So that's exactly how it works with with valuing how too.
No, but the difference is when you're valuing how, right? You're not actually experiencing war. You have experienced it in the past.
Mm-hmm.
The phenomenal aspects of your experience are gone. What you have are declarative memories that remain.
But you have the ability to assign value. That's my point. Just like you know how to ride a bike. If you've read it before, maybe you can't like kind of characterize it propositionally, but you know how to ride the bike. And when you get on it and you ride the bike. And the same thing is you've had the experiences which then give you knowledge how to kind of assign value to that. And it's not like you have to like, I mean... Yeah, we can. I mean, it's like there's nothing crazy being said here. Take the expert who's had lots of take Sherman or whatever, right? It's not that he has to be able to now feel all the feelings he felt in battle, but he has to have had those experiences, so he's encoded and can represent in whatever attenuated form the knowledge in the right way. Just like to ride a bike, it's not like I have to know what it feels like explicitly to get on that bike and ride it. It just happens because I respond in the right sense. There's think of kind of gut reactions, things like that.
Can I just press this one more time?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just don't see what the disanalogy is.
So the disanalogy is this: when you learn to ride a bicycle, you have these proprioceptive experiences, all sorts of visual experiences, and so forth, and that gives rise to a memory trace that's purely physiological in the kind of causal connections between sensory experiences of a certain type and physical
I don't think
behaviors.
I don't think you can assume it's, but okay,
and
let's just say that.
But
anyway,
then when you get on the bike again, right, you don't have to remember the previous experiences, what they were like, because you've got this causal mechanism that is established now and allows you to ride the bike. In the case of experience of war and then later valuing, it's just not plausible that what gets encoded is this kind of, motor control mechanism that's based on certain types of experience.
That's right. But nobody said it was a motor control mechanism.
It's going to be a propositional attitude of certain kind, a certain value.
No. So you're building in all kinds of things that I didn't say,
okay.
right?
No, I'm
so,
just wondering how it's supposed to go. So the disanalogy.
well, okay,
is
let me tell you. If you let me tell you, I'll tell you.
But wait,
Okay.
the disanalogy is that it's
Okay.
gone, right? And you don't have any new things to rely on. No new experiences as inputs to whatever process that you have in the riding of the bicycle case. You feel yourself on the bicycle. That's a current experience that triggers the
You might be
output.
over relying on one particular example of like knowledge how. Okay. So not all knowledge how is like riding a bicycle. The idea is supposed to be that there's a kind of expertise and facility that you have because facts have been presented to you from using different modes of presentation. And then the thought is, neurologically, when those facts have been kind of presented to you in a distinctive kind of mode of presentation, you get a certain capacity. Maybe it's kind of a gut value response, or it's like usually characterized as a kind of intuitive knowledge and understanding, either to like assign value, to make plans, whatever you want, however you want to kind of capture. Like what is the expert, the general who's got the battle hardened general has expertise about how like to and how to respond to an enemy, or how to perform various kinds of techniques, or how the troops will respond to certain kinds of contexts. What are they drawing on? Well, they're certainly drawing on memory, but it's not like they have to kind of re-feel things, right? It's rather that their experience already taught them something and gave them a kind of expert knowledge that then they leverage in that context. That's like, I mean, nobody, like I feel like, if I had some weird view that was like super straw manny where I'm making all kinds of speculative claims, which I didn't do, then yeah, that would be weird. But no, this is actually something that's utterly familiar.
Okay, I'm not allowed to say. Yeah. Can I just say, how is that different from testimony?
Well,
Testimony from your past self.
Well, because testimony is propositional. This is not propositional. That's the whole point.
That was fun.
Yes, thanks, Laurie. Well, I don't know enough about cognitive science to be commenting in this area anyway, so this is a rather different question. But actually, it's not a question. I guess I just wanted to make a couple of comments, like basically in support of some things I took you to be saying, but you can tell me whether that's the case. So one is, so I take it that you're saying that, it's not just that we may need a certain acquaintance to understand what some scenario is like, but beyond that, we may need some acquaintance to moreover know how to value this scenario, right? And maybe this emphasis on values does resonate with me. And actually, I wonder whether we might want to take it even further. Like, it seems like a lot of what we're talking about when we think about even just understanding a scenario is what it is am I noticing about the scenario precisely because it's of value.
Well, yeah.
So, for instance, I happen to just have been reading a book, All Quiet on the Western Front, right, about, this depiction of a soldier's experience in the war. But, the thing that I'm noticing and what I'm becoming acquainted with when I read the book is like, what is it that this guy notices in the war and values? And some of it's quite surprising, like, about the mundanity of things. And, the fact that like you're happy because half the regiment got killed and it means there's more dinner tonight because their rations go to you guys. And like, it's like, oh, I didn't know that's how someone would, that's a value you might have. But I can sort of see how, I can see how you might have that value, once it's described in some detail. So it's almost like it's actually the values that I'm most interested in when I'm reading the book.
I see.
Rather than like the description and then of the scenario and then, how do I value that? It's like you go straight to the values, like what it is that someone even cares about in that situation. So anyway, that's just, it's sort of like cheerleading the emphasis on values. And there was one other thing and I think also part of what's unfamiliar, and this may be riffing on your other point about we don't know what testimony to look for. Yeah. It seems like part of what happens in new situations is you you become people you didn't think you would become. Like I thought in my, just to give another personal experience, in my current situation at the university, I feel like I've become more of an activist, and I sort of didn't think, I thought of activists as other types, and actually I felt like I was missing something important because I didn't really have an activist urge, and like now I feel like actually maybe I do have an activist.
Just need a little fascism and
and so like it's sort of like you don't know who you're actually who you're closest to, without sort of being in situations where you're like, yes, I am similar to that person. Anyway, that's just
no. So like part of this talk is to say, look, there's all this discussion about knowledge and expertise, and we should be talking about its relationship to value and decision making, and like it just seems so obvious to me. But you're right that once you start thinking about it, it's like very intertwined. And this is, I'm really at the stage where I'm just making these connections. But valuing is like, it's certainly in practical contexts, to really know something like requires in some sense that you need to like that you value it in the right way, and you understand, like you go through these models. Like when you're reading, one of the things that I struggle with is I think that art or narrative teach us something about these new environments, but they don't teach, like they teach you something, but I don't know what it is they teach us, right? But some of what you're saying is maybe what they do is they kind of help you articulate the structure that you should be, that you might be using when you try to discover the value first, or something like that. So I appreciate the thoughts. I'm just trying to think all through through all of this stuff.
No, it's in.
Okay. Ori.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks. So I didn't quite understand how the reference class problem was supposed to illuminate the knowledge by acquaintance thought, and maybe take a sort of extreme example to explain what I'm not getting. So suppose that, imagine a case where there is a sort of clear reference class, right? So suppose that you have 1,000 clones of yourself, and they have all been to war, and they all come back, describe it the exactly same way. They all say it's horrible, and they sort of they explain that it's horrible in the same way, and so on. Now, if so then we sort of, it's unclear whether we have the reference class problem. But
Right.
If the transformative experience story is true, or correct, then we still don't know, or I still don't know, what it's like to be at war. So it seems to me that the reference class problem is just a very different type of problem than the sort of transformative experience problem.
Oh, so let's talk about. So the thought is that so if you have like 1,000 duplicates, the reason why you don't have a reference class problem is because you're similar to all of them, and there are no difference. There are no properties that you have to, like, you don't have to figure out, are there any relevant differences, because there are no differences.
Yeah, and you know that this is the sort of reference class to which you belong, that sort of more accurately matches all of your characteristics than any other possible reference.
Yeah,
class.
I'm happy to let's build that in so we understand that. So if that part is solved, now my thought was that the reference class problem in the transformative experience case, it doesn't teach you how, like, it's not about you knowing how to value. The thought is, well, ordinarily, you might, when someone says, "Oh, just use testimony to solve your decision problem, you transformative chooser. What are you so worried about?" Right? Go and look at the scientific or the testimonial evidence there, because unfortunately there aren't 1,000 versions. Actually, unfortunately there aren't 1,000 versions of me out there. So I've always got a heterogeneous set of a heterogeneous population that I have to evaluate. So my thought was, in that case, if I had a certain kind of expertise, I can navigate that problem. That's the expertise that's lacking, at least one of the things that's lacking in the testimony, in the ordinary solution. That was the thought. It's not the only problem with relying on testimony, because I think the authorship problem is the other problem. But if I could at least, so I think already the testimony strategy is problematic because I face a reference class problem. And the thought is it's a kind of an intuitive acquaintance reference class problem. Does that?
Yeah. So I mean, so
Well, oh wait, let me just. Sorry, I'm cutting you off, but I forgot. I said when I use the example of like how do we normally solve it, we imaginatively evolve ourselves in various ways. So like you get some scientific evidence and you think, well, okay, oh yeah, I could see myself making that choice in that circumstance or whatever, and that's what's lacking. And so if you had that ability, then I would say if you could evolve yourself imaginatively, maybe you could solve the reference class problem.
Right. But you still have this sort of more fundamental transformative experience.
Yes,
problem, right?
exactly. Yeah. I'm just trying to kind of, because like bringing together these two different discussions, I think, is useful in a kind of larger sense too. So trying to map out how, even independently of the transformative experience question, there's an interesting kind of overlap between like value by acquaintance and the reference class problem. Yeah.
Okay, I think I have a question, and it's sort of a sympathetic comment. So you might be shocked, because I'm the one who called you a texture fetishist.
Yes, exactly.
Which you
I need a slide for that. Yeah, it's so good. Yeah,
t-shirt.
I want a T-shirt.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So I agree fully that there are some values that are really in need of, you need to experience them to really sort of understand them and value them properly, especially, let's say, gustatory values, right? Mm-hmm. So we have I have an aunt, you have an aunt, but it's my sort of by indirect aunt-in-law, aunt-in-law, and she has this tendency always saying, she's a vegetarian, right? She always says, oh, this meat dish is so tasty. And she's never tasted meat.
All right, she's like offering it to you.
So she doesn't know how to value meat, right? Mm-hmm. And she's never tasted. So that's sort of a very strange thing to say. Mm-hmm. So that's one example where really something is missing. And of course, there might be also some aesthetic cases, I think, right? You have sort of fantastic painting or something like that. But have you seen it? No.
Then why are you telling me it's so awesome? You haven't even seen it yourself.
So,
yeah. Okay.
So at least, of course, you can have some testimony there, perhaps, right? But it's still something is off when you just say it's fantastic, and haven't actually seen it at all. But then the examples you gave are of a different kind, right? Because they are multifaceted and they are involving a lot of, as I said, subjective values of different kinds, right? Mm-hmm. And take, for instance, this the cello player case, and also the military case. It would be the wrong thing to say, look, just try to imagine, something new here, so to speak. No. If you are playing the cello, right, already, and if you are training to be a soldier, you have experiences that are relevant, that actually can fill in some gaps in what it is to actually be there in combat. That's why they do combat simulation, right? Not just to sort of know how to shoot, but actually how to deal with stress, fear, surprise, and actually pain, right? Because some of these simulations are painful and actually are threatened. I mean, they will actually be hurt if they're not careful.
That's why they do it, right? That's right.
Dangerous, right? Especially some of them.
Yeah.
So that means that it's not so black and white. Sometimes it sounds like it's unintelligible, but it's not, right? They can actually fill in some of the gaps. And in fact, other people who have done it can come back and help us with filling in the gaps, because they can say, look, I had no clue it would be that bad. This is, you have had the experience, right, being this simulation training camp, right? Yeah. It is like that plus this, and then they can actually help you to even fill in a little bit more. So the testimony is sort of about an experience, but it can help you if you're sufficiently similar to sort of even fill it in a bit more, right? So and then you have a partial grasp, right? And a partial grasp sometimes can actually help you do some kind of decisions, right? Because there's decision-making under partial grasps of your states of nature, and there are some theories about how to do that, of course. And so it's not completely hopeless.
Okay.
Okay.
So, yeah, and so I'm partially sympathetic and partially, I mean, no, so I mean, I didn't disagree with anything that you said, except that I think I'm less optimistic that you are in some sense. And there's some interesting issues here. One really interesting issue is whether like just scaling up, whether that's kind of more of the same or a change in kind. And I actually just think that for a number of very intense sensory experiences, there's some kind of change in kind. So it's like, yeah, I've had like some pain, but then like try giving birth, right? Like that's just like off the charts, unless you're getting an epidural or whatever, right? So I can tell you this, but in fact, I don't think I can tell you like how painful that is. Like, so
Actually relates to
yeah. Sorry, let's yeah. No, that's a really good.
Actually built in such a way that you will forget it. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Barbara Montero has a really nice paper about this, actually, about how look, it's like she says, look, weirdly, you can't like people do it again, and I mean, in this kind of context, okay, we can go back to that, but So, there are a lot of really complicated issues here. Some of them, there's no research on this either. Like I talked to psychologists about some of this. And so here's an open space of conversations to have. First of all, combining different kinds of kind of qualitative experiences can result in like entirely new kinds of things. Okay. Gustatory experiences are actually some of the simplest ones, especially along the same dimension, combining like one flavor with another. That's the easiest kind of thing to do. Try like sensations of different categories, right? Like feeling pain, I don't know, versus whatever, eating a banana. I don't know, like when you combine the different ones, new kinds of like just new sorts of things can happen, and there just isn't a lot of research on how people would respond to that. So that's like one issue. A second one is even if we just kind of scale up, like I said, like intense fear versus moderate fear might just be like a thing that shifts into a different value, like a different kind of value register, right? It's much more, it's not like it gets a little bit worse, a little bit worse, a little bit worse, the more scared you get. It's rather at some point, it's just incredibly bad or overwhelmingly bad, something like that. If that's the case, I think it is the case, then the reason I worry is because I say, well, yeah, we can do some simulation, and the whole reason for doing simulation is to try to prepare us. Part of the problem is sometimes we don't do the right simulation, and then we're in the problem. But sometimes, even if we do simulation, it by itself just isn't enough. And in transformative experience cases, that's why I like these cases, because those are the kinds of cases where things are so intense that it's more likely to not be enough.
You mean enough to make a rational decision?
Enough to know, how to value in the expert way that I'm looking for. And maybe it's because when you're in this very intense state, like, yeah, other things matter. So for example, just going back to like the having a baby case is my favorite case. Like a thing that was salient to me, in addition to the pain, was realizing there's this thing inside me that has to come out, and physically, like it just seems to violate all the laws, and that just had not occurred to me. I know it's obvious, but it's like it doesn't occur to you in this special way until you're in that situation. That's just an example. It was kind of funny. I also saw I was like laughing and crying at the same time or whatever when I realized this. But like that's just the kind of thing that doesn't become obvious to you until you're actually in that kind of heightened context. So I just worry about this. So
yeah, so I share that there's a concern how to act under this kind of phenomenological uncertainty, especially if so much of the values are tied to subjective values. Of course,
yes.
We have also objective values, right?
Yes, of course, and yeah.
In many cases, much more important is this war actually justified?
Exactly.
And so on, right? Which you can know before you go there.
Absolutely.
So it depends on how you weigh the subjective against the objective, and also sometimes combinations of subjective experiences might get a new subjective experience, but it's not relatively relevant. Actually, it's just sort of didn't know it. You combine these two things, it's like that, but it's not actually. Can also distort.
I think so. Yeah. So there's
sometimes you're too close, right, to the whole thing.
That's right.
And you can't see it from a good distance, and therefore you exaggerate the values, right?
That's right.
Of your own experience, for instance, your own pain. Let's say.
I
think it's really awful for people like me, but you forget about the other people there.
Not like
you're actually hurting or killing.
Exactly. It's even worse for them.
So that's actually a way to lose knowledge, value knowledge, by getting into the combat zone. And as you mentioned, Kate had an example too, that you become indifferent to other people's
and to suffer or experience joy.
So
like
that's not gaining knowledge about something; that's losing knowledge.
And maybe actually, and part of what this is, is bringing out for me is that. So I think there's a conversation to be had about value expertise that I think is worth having. And also, right, about how, how one can even, and how value expertise also, as you can see, can be warped in various ways, right? I mean, but again, in order to be able to kind of have this kind of information, I think that like acquaintance is playing a significant role. Maybe that's kind of good enough for the conversation that we're having, that there's like, I'm even if we might disagree about how much value expertise might matter in certain kinds of contexts, I think there's like some open space here that's like super important. And I wanted to relate it back to this stuff about transformation. That's a particularly hard case for this kind of thing. Okay. Yeah.
Joe actually has a finger.
Hi. I keep slightly like losing hold of this question, so it may not succeed. Anyway, the question I have is somewhere in between Ori and Krista's, I think, because I guess the broad thing I want to understand is if you could characterize like how much you would want to know in order to make the decision. Because I think in line with Krista, I'm someone who I work on decision-making under uncertainty. And I feel like there's always loads of stuff we don't know when we make decisions. And we could always be wrong in these quite drastic ways. And part of the game is about figuring out the sort of strategies which can slightly position us better or worse. And then at some point to just accept that sometimes you do the best you can with the limited information you had. And so when I think about the things that I've done that maybe count as transformative, like emigrating to Sweden, there are, of course, many things about the texture of being here now that I didn't know, and I agree that I couldn't have known. But were they, in some sense, hampering my ability to make the choices, the thing that I think I'm kind of occasionally getting and occasionally losing? Because I think that I could navigate the reference class problem in some ways. I could talk to different kinds of people who had emigrated to Sweden and get a sense of like the pattern of how many said it was transformative or not. It's not that much of a culture shock, or it's super weird, the food they eat or whatever, and then try to align those with things that I think are important about me and do bits of this imaginative projection and then decide I think it'll be okay. And then it was indeed okay. It just had lots of textual details I didn't have. And so I guess I don't have a sense of like, I think you could always find more details that we wouldn't have, but that can't be a threshold for how to make the decision, because then otherwise we wouldn't make any decisions under uncertainty.
Yeah, I mean, some of this, okay. Some of this, I mean, if you're a fetishist, you're a fetishist. Like, I mean, so no, one of the things about the discussion of transformative decision making, Lisa, was important to me, and I was trying to bring out, was first, in some sense, this issue, like, oh, we need to attend to how much texture, how much whatever, kind of the nature and how much of the character of the experience matters to us, and how we're thinking about it when we make these decisions. And certainly when I first started working on this, and I continue to, I'm kind of fascinated by the balance between kind of making a decision without any of that information and then trying to kind of get some of that information. I mean, you could say the same about like you go buy a house or whatever. Like people, it's very important to people. They feel it's very important for them to kind of go and like see the house, not buy it sight unseen. I mean, people do that, but and it's at least whether or not it actually maps out or whether or not this is actually true, it matters to people to find out the texture, let's say, of the kitchen or something like that, that they're going to make their meals in or whatever. So they do it. Okay. So there's at least, even if we shouldn't care about this, I would say there's a very natural tendency to care about it. I tend to be someone who does care about it. But what I'm happy for people to say, oh, we were wrong all along. Actually, we shouldn't be caring about it. I think that's a surprise. Okay, so first of all. Okay, the second thing is, not just with respect to the debate about how much should we care about the nature of the experience that we're choosing or whatever, the ones we're deciding between or and assigning value. But also, I think there's a really interesting difference between ordinary decision-making and transformative decision-making. And that difference, that's another thing I've been like trying to push. So even if everything that you're saying is right about like ordinary decision-making, transformative decisions are just like, you would have thought that our decision models that we spend so much time working on, like you would have thought, well, that's exactly what we should reach for in these cases where the stakes are so high. But it turns out that's exactly where we have the most problem. I'm really interested in that fact. What are the implications? Different people might draw different kinds of conclusions. Maybe because they're transformative, that's exactly the kind of case where you should not attend at all to the quality, like the fetish, the texture, right? That might be the result. I mean, I get that. But I think that's kind of astounding and kind of fascinating. And then I would go back to why does one care? Well, that's where I was trying to get at the authenticity, like the authorship. So this is a long answer, but like, so to try to bring it out is let's say I'm making a forced choice between like being a philosopher and emigrating to Sweden. Hopefully that one would not have to make that. That would be a terrible forced choice. Or being I don't know, being a dentist and being a cellist or something like that. Like I have to choose something. Both of them presumably ultimately will be transformative. And do I just go with the testimony, or do I do it in this other kind of way that reflects on who I am as a person and blah, blah, blah? Well, if I'm going to do it rationally, it seems like I should just go via the testimony. But in cases where I'm deciding how I'm going to spend my life, it seems like I want to author. I want to author though. I think there's an intuition there that that one is supposed to reflect and deliberate and, construct oneself in some new way. And that's why the unintelligibility thing is really problematic. If you haven't got texture, you haven't got intelligibility, I would say. Maybe it doesn't matter in the end, but yeah, okay. Yeah.
On that point, thank you so much for a very interesting talk. Yes, thank you.